In this video, we will be replacing the front brake pads in this 2010 Nissan Xterra. To prep the vehicle, I have installed wheel chocks behind the rear tires. I have set the parking brake. I have jacked the front of the vehicle up just enough so that the front tires rotate. And I have installed safety stands underneath the vehicle. We're going to begin by removing the front tire. Make sure you loosen the lug nuts in a star-shaped pattern. If we take a look at the wheel assembly, we can see that we have the rotor, which is the round disc looking thing. We have the brake caliper and caliper mounting bracket. Inside of this, we have our brake pads. Taking a closer look at our brake caliper, we need to locate the caliper bolts. There's one located on the top and one located on the bottom of the caliper. It's always good to have a drip pan underneath where you're working. Because these bolts have been in a long time and they are probably rusted and corroded, we're going to be using Amsoil's metal protector, which acts as a penetrating oil to help loosen these parts. Using a 14mm wrench, we can loosen the caliper bolts. And then we can remove both of those bolts by hand. Once our caliper bolts have been removed, we can work off the caliper. Using an old coat hanger, we're going to create a hook to hold the caliper so it doesn't fall. If the caliper were to fall off without having this coat hanger, the only thing that would catch it is the rubber brake line, which could cause that rubber brake line to rupture. Thus, we need this extra measure to ensure that doesn't happen. If we take a look back to our brake caliper location, we can see what we have left is the brake caliper mounting bracket. We also have the brake pads. We will be replacing the brake pads, but we also need to clean up the rotor, so we will need to remove the brake caliper mounting bracket. We can remove our spring and wiggle out our brake pads. We are now left with our brake caliper mounting bracket and our brake pad hardware, which is mounted inside of our brake caliper mounting bracket. If we follow our bracket around to the back side, we can see that there are two bolts that are holding that in. Using a little more Amsoil's metal protector, we can lubricate these bolts, as they also have been in there a long time and are probably rusted and corroded. After that metal protector has soaked in, we can use a 19mm wrench to loosen those bolts. Once we remove those bolts, our bracket will come off. Next, we need to remove the rotor. This may be rusted on, so I'm applying Amsoil's metal protector to each of the stud locations. and hopefully that penetrating oil will get in there and loosen up any rusty parts. I'll also spray the back side of it. And using a rubber mallet, I can gently work the rotor off of the wheel assembly. So we have our driver's side rotor and our passenger side rotor. If I feel the rotor surface, it's in pretty good condition, which might be a good candidate to have the rotors turned down instead of buying new ones. Using a rotor caliper, I can measure the thickness of my rotor to determine its size. The driver's side has a thickness of 1.104 and the passenger side has a thickness of 1.105. After calling the auto parts store, I found out that the rotor discard thickness is 1.024 inches. If I take my current thickness and subtract the discard thickness, that will give me a calculation for how much material I can actually remove. In this case, it is about 80 thousandths on each of these rotors. While our rotors are being turned down at the auto parts store, we're going to prep our components for reinstallation. First, we're going to take a look at the caliper. Inside the caliper we have two pistons. As your brakes wear, the pistons will move out farther, compensating for the brake wear. Because we are installing new brake pads that are significantly thicker than our old used brake pads, we need to reset the pistons back into the caliper. I'm first going to coat the pistons with Amsoil's metal protector to help clean off any corrosion or rust and to ensure that these parts move freely. Next, I'm going to place an old brake pad in front of my caliper pistons. Next, I'm going to put a C-clamp or screw type clamp around the brake pad and caliper. With the clamp installed and snugged down, I'm going to locate the bleed screw. The bleed screw is covered by a dust boot, and we can use a flathead screwdriver to gently work that off. I'm going to apply some more Amsoil's metal protector to that bleed screw. And I'm then going to take the back end of a drill bit and I'm going to slip that into the bleed screw. This will help prevent that bleeder screw from breaking as I loosen it. Using a 10mm tubing wrench, we can then loosen up our bleeder screw. And we'll snug that down just until the fluid is not coming out. So I'm going to open the bleeder screw slightly. I'm then going to tighten my screw clamp. This will force the pistons back into the caliper. Any residual dirty brake fluid will be exited through the bleeder screw. Once our caliper pistons have been reset back into the housing, we can close our bleeder screw. And then we can remove that clamp and old brake pad. Keep in mind though, we need to bleed all of the brakes at the end of this service. We now have our rotors back after having them resurfaced at the auto parts store. Out of curiosity, I wanted to measure the thickness of our newly resurfaced rotors. My first rotor measures 1.070 inches. This means that 0.034 inches were removed during the resurfacing operation. Given that our new thickness is 1.070 and our discard thickness is 1.024, we have 0.046 that can still be removed from this rotor. And since this time they removed 0.034, we should, in theory, be able to have this rotor surfaced one additional time the next time we do brakes. My second rotor measures 1.080 inches. After running all of the math for the passenger side rotor, I come to the same conclusion that we should be able to resurface this rotor one additional time the next time that we do brakes again. Now this concept doesn't apply if the rotors get warped or if you run the brake pads into the rotors or some other thing happens where you have damage to the rotor. Before installing our newly refinished rotors onto the wheel assembly, I'm going to clean both sides with brake and parts cleaner. Amsoil's brake and parts cleaner is a professional strength parts cleaner. It will quickly remove oil, grease, brake fluid, and other contaminants. Before I install the rotor, I'm going to coat the wheel assembly with Amsoil's heavy-duty metal protector. This acts as a corrosion inhibitor and will help prevent things from getting rusted, and the next time this has to come off, it should come off a lot easier. I like to temporarily install one lug nut on the bottom stud so the rotor doesn't move around as I'm installing my other components. This will hold it in place and make things go a little bit easier. I'm next going to shift my attention to the brake caliper mounting bracket. This bracket still has the old brake hardware installed. I'm going to remove this because our new brake pads came with new hardware. Using a little bit of Amsoil's metal protector and a wire brush, I'm going to clean the surface where the brake hardware sits. And then we can install our new brake pad hardware. Before installing the brake caliper mounting bracket back on, I'm going to respray my rotor with the brake and parts cleaner. We can then reinstall our brake caliper mounting bracket. I'm going to clean the rotors one more time before I install the brake pads. The next step is to install the brake pads. You want to make sure you have the pad side facing the rotor. The brake pads should slide in fairly easily. Installing the upper and lower brake hardware springs in the tiny holes on the brake pads will help keep the brake pads from getting stuck on the rotor. I'm going to give it one more shot of brake and parts cleaner before we install the caliper. And we'll come back with our 14mm wrench and tighten those down. Once the caliper has been reinstalled, we'll spray it one more time with brake and parts cleaner. And then we can reinstall the wheel. And we can torque that down to the correct specs. Once the wheels have been put back on the vehicle, before you do anything else, step on the brake pedal several times. The first couple times it should sink to the floor and gradually become more firm. This is resetting those pistons inside the caliper to accommodate the thickness of the new brake pads. Before the test drive, I like to mash on the brakes a couple times just to make sure everything is working properly. Everything looks pretty good.
Struggle bus.